Turkey-US security partnership. And we have three excellent panelists about discussing these issues. Mark Kimmitt, General Mark Kimmitt, defense consultant and in MTK Defense Consultants. Richard Outzen from the State Department, and Kadir Ustun, Executive Director of SETA D.C. And we will discuss a wide range of issues, and we will start with General Kimmitt to his remarks.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. And as Richard knows, the worst absolute opportunity to speak is right after lunch, because we know that half of you are going to be nodding off. The other half of you have already left. So what's left is a very, very committed, but I certainly hope not tired crowd. It's very interesting to watch what's happening today in Helsinki. If you take a look at the great arguments that are happening among the American chattering class and the President of the United States, the great question is, should we be friends with Russia? Well, that's sort of the Facebook way of looking at international politics. Are you going to get a like if you are friends with Russia? The president has been quite clear. It's not about being friends. And anybody who's taken a freshman course in diplomacy knows the old quote, which is, countries don't have friends, they have interests. And that, metaphorically, is the same with the United States and Turkey. We've been through some bumpy times recently. We've been through some bumpy times. I was reading an article just last night talking about the great collapse of relationship between Turkey and the United States in the immediate aftermath of the second invasion into Iraq. I think nobody here needs to be reminded of the great challenges our two countries had at that time, but we got over them. Now, so if you start off with the predicate that we're not here to make friends, the security partnership is exactly that. A partnership is a set of conditions to which both sides, on both sides of the table, benefit from that relationship. I would say there are very few people in this world that had a session with Donald Trump on one side of the table, you on the other side, who would walk away from that conversation or that debate as friends. But it is certainly the case you came across as respect for each other, and hopefully the contract had been sealed between the two of them. So that's what I think we need to be focused on, not only in the aftermath of July 15th, where that partnership, those interests diverged so significantly, and continue to focus going forward. Now, this is absolutely the wrong room as well to be lecturing on why this is important. But it might be helpful for those that could find this on YouTube to remember, first and foremost, it's about geography. If you take a look at the location of Turkey, it is an enormously geostrategically significant country in terms of its geography. It separates Asia from Europe. It owns the entrances to the Black Sea, where our United States ships are operating right now, being tailed by Russian ships as we try to determine how to work our way through our relationships with Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine, Crimea, so on and so forth. It is not simply the gateway to Europe, primarily and most recently for the refugee crisis that we're seeing in the Middle East, but it is also the gateway to the Middle East for Europe. Look at the countries that Turkey is bordered by. The Caucasus as a region which is so significant not only to Europe but to the United States. Iran, nothing needs to be said there. Iraq, nothing needs to be said there. Syria, nothing needs to be said there. So on the fundamental predicate of the relationship, we need the geography. We need to be able to influence the geography for not simply military reasons, but all the other diplomatic, economic relationships that we have in that region, of which Turkey is at the center point of that. The second issue is just the sheer scale of the security establishment within Turkey. If you take France, Germany, and the United Kingdom and add their active forces, their reserve forces, and their interior forces, those three countries, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, you put them together, they are still smaller than the security establishment inside of Turkey, of their military, active duty, reservists, and gendarmerie. You take a look at the main battle tanks, the 2,300 plus main battle tanks inside of Turkey, larger than, to my belief, the remainder of Europe. You take a look at the budget that is put forth to defense. That's a very, very robust budget. Frankly, I want Turkey and I want the Turkish security establishment on the United States side. I don't want to be facing across from them as Turkey falls into the orbit of the Soviet Union at one time and Russia now. NATO. We've all seen what's happened recently with NATO. It has been a very tense relationship as our president has tried to convince NATO and the NATO countries in particular to live up to the commitments they've made. A minimum commitment, 2% of GDP. Turkey has done that. That's not a question. And that's one of the reasons why I think our president has aligned himself so well with the Turkish governance, the Turkish government, and why our military continues to be working its way through its relationships with the Turkish military. When you look at what's happening in Syria right now through the lens of the European Command, they find it unfortunate what has happened over the past 12 months with regards to northern Syria in general, Manbij in particular. CENTCOM has a different view. That's the odd relationship between the Central Command, which focuses on the Middle East, and the European Command. All I can say is everyone is happy for the Manbij agreement. Today, the United States announced that the withdrawal of the YPG from Manbij is complete. I know that view is not completely shared on the part of the Turkish military establishment, but it is heading in the right direction. And then, frankly, the last point I would make about NATO and Turkish alliance with the United States, very few other countries can say they fought alongside or operated alongside the United States during the Korean War, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and there are very few countries that still allows the United States free and open access to an airbase such as Incirlik, and candidly, our ability for years and years to be able to station nuclear weapons inside of a foreign country. So this is a country that is in the interest of the United States to maintain a strong security partnership. It's not always the time that we will open up our Facebook accounts and see a lot of likes and hearts and emojis talking about our relationship, but that's not what military security partnerships are about. That's not what diplomatic relationships are about, but it is what security partnerships are about. And in this case, where the security partnership between the United States and Turkey is in many ways, and has been over the years, the foundation for those other partnerships, economic, diplomatic, and in this case, counterterrorism. Why my belief is that this coup on the 15th of July was so unfortunate, as well as the other issues that continue to affect the security partnership. But I remain hopeful and very optimistic that that security partnership will not only prevail, but will improve over the years.
Thank you. Rich?
Well, first of all, Kilic and Kadir and to the rest of the staff at SETA, I'm very thankful for the opportunity to join you, and especially so with General Kimmitt, who's an old friend and a former boss of mine, and an inspiration in terms of policy analysis.
Are you nervous?
Yes, I'm very.
Also, I'd like to express my sense of condolence and solidarity with the Turkish people on the second anniversary of, I have a hard time calling it a coup. I think of it as a factional mutiny or uprising, but what a horrible event that was. I think it's very hard for Americans still to really understand the depth to which that shook Turkish society and the state and the reverberations that continue today. I think a lot of people jump to conclusions about where Turkey is at and where we're at with Turkey, somewhat forgetting that in the midst of a traumatic event like that, that the reverberations and the adjustment periods stretch on for some years. So I wish the Turkish people a continued recovery from that event and the re-strengthening of the institutions that were damaged and riven, not just by the coup, but by the several years that led up to it, during which time there was a real competition for the sort of sovereignty of the state. So ordinarily, I like to go into great historical depth as well about all the depth of the historical security relationship, and that is the topic of our panel, the future of security relations, and how the ups and downs have gone. And as General Kimmitt has noted, many times the Turks have been at our side in very important conflicts and struggles, the Cold War paradigm essentially, and then after. And then also the fact that there's been downs, the aftermath of the Cyprus invasion, the embargo years, the aftermath of Operation Iraqi Freedom, when we were not able to reach a consensus and a conclusion about how to operate together. But I think really we don't need to go into that amount of depth about that. I think for today's purposes, we're familiar with the relevant background. I will just draw out one thing from that, though, from that history, which is that security has always been at the heart of the U.S.-Turkey relationship. That's both a curse and a blessing. It's a blessing because we've had a lot of common threat perception, threat prioritization, and things that we can do together about those things. It's been a bit of a curse because, on the other hand, we've had insufficient tourism going back and forth both ways. We've probably underperformed in terms of bilateral trade. I think there's a lot that can be done there. The economic and diplomatic and people-to-people dimensions of the relationship have always been subordinate to the security dimensions of the relationship. Well, as long as our threat perception was more or less the same, that was actually a sustainable model. And beginning with 1945, the Stalin letter, basically to the Turks threatening Turkey based on the Straits, ownership of the Straits and the rights of passage under the Montreux Convention, and also the eastern portions of Turkey that had one time been under Russian control. Turkey felt a very proximate sense of threat from the Soviet Union. We shared that because this was the dawning of the bipolar world. It was just starting to become clear to us in those years, 45, 46, 47, that the expansionist nature of the Soviet Union was a threat to all of the countries with whom we were allied, and Turkey joined that and stayed solidly within it for 45 years. The problem was, after 90 and 91, this great unifying glue of a common sense of threat disappeared. And after that, membership, by the way, not just between the feelings of membership and loyalty and solidarity between the US and Turkey, but really among all the NATO nations, became much more contingent and much more complicated. I was a lieutenant in the Army in Turkey in 90 and 91 and went to Germany in 92 through 94. And frankly, the attitude of the Germans towards the US forces changed dramatically at that time. I mean, the politics of the entire alliance shifted in a way that really has not fully shaken out even today. And some of these questions about the identity of NATO, is it a civilizational alliance? Should it transform into really a counterterrorism alliance? Or do we still have this generalized Eurasian Eastern threat that we all see in the same way and respond in the same way? That still has not shaken out. So I think that we should keep in mind that this is not, there are some unique factors in the US-Turkey iteration of that, but it is a broader transatlantic issue than just the US and Turkey. I would say today we actually have maybe the primary driver of bilateral irritation in the relationship is unfortunately once again security. That thing that was the bedrock has become the main irritation in a sense now. And the reason is we have different threat perceptions. So Turkey's major perceptions of threat focus on the PKK and all the groups that are in one way or another aligned with or affiliated with the PKK, and with what the Turkish government refers to as FETÖ, the Fethullah Gülen terror organization. I think here we have a challenge because for most Americans, they tend to see those two issues, the PKK and FETÖ, as law enforcement or legal issues, rather than as hard security issues. Meanwhile, the things that we consider to be the hard security issues, first and foremost ISIS in the Middle East, I think Turkey, in sort of a reciprocal way, sees primarily as a legal and a counterterrorism police type issue as opposed to a physical, geographical, hard national security threat. Until those two perceptions are aligned or at least made mutually compatible, we're going to have problems in the security relationship. One thing, as I go through just listening to different presentations related to the 2-year anniversary of the coup, is that there is still a paucity of information in the English language about what happened during the coup and before. I know Hakan Yavuz and a number of others that contributed on a book that addressed the 15th July coup. That's really the first book-length treatment that I think has been addressed in the English language or widely available. But to understand what happened on 15th of July means understanding the competition for Turkish judiciary, for the Turkish military, for the security services, as well as the political contest that broke out in late 2012 and into 2013. But we just don't have a lot of good, serious academic treatments of that. Having been with the Turkish military as a liaison officer in 2009 and 10 in Afghanistan, and then before that, 2001 to 2003, serving in Turkey, this was not news to me when it happened. The idea that this competition was going on was absolutely evident to anybody who was following Turkish political military affairs. By the way, I should have said this right at the beginning. I'm here not representing State Department views or policy. I'm here in my personal role as a commentator, so any of my comments and views are not reflective necessarily of what the department's position is. Now, there's a big, what I would call an evidentiary problem here. People talk about the evidentiary problems in terms of extradition with Fethullah Gulen and tying him directly to the coup. That's something that our legal experts are talking about, whether the two governments can agree on what evidence would constitute direct involvement as opposed to something more indirect. But if you take a step back from the legal procedures, we have an evidentiary problem in terms of the United States as a whole. American people don't know really what to make out of the coup. Is it still purely an internal thing? Was it really just the same old Turkish military doing their thing? What is the connection to what, when Fethullah Gulen is referred to as a cleric or a preacher, in sort of pushing to the side all the other ties and organizational linkages that he had to pieces of the Turkish state and to operations in Turkey that culminated in the coup. Americans just don't have access to that information, or let's say it hasn't been presented to them in a way that makes it convincing and ready. I mention that only because once that is achieved, once I think Americans have the full evidentiary treatment of what happened leading up to the 15th of July, then it's going to be, I think, a very different conversation between Turkey and the United States, because then the threat perceptions will be somewhat more aligned. I think in general, the alignment will also improve following the winding down of the Syria conflict. Now, I don't know, I can't predict exactly what the terms are going to be under which the Syrian conflict will end, but I think much has happened in the last year or two to put it closer to the end than it was when we were having these same conversations 2 years ago and 3 years ago. I am one of those who believes that the Syrian conflict has been a unique distorting feature on the U.S.-Turkey relationship, and that goes back to 2012, 2013. It's not just a function of when we started providing arms to the Syrian Democratic Forces as they came across into Manbij. When you have a problem of alignment of the depth that we're talking about here, it sort of suggests a two-phase approach, especially when security is the main locus of disagreement. The first is we have to address in very, very careful terms the security disagreements that we have. And then second, we need to strengthen the rest of the relationship so that when there is a security issue that divides the two countries, that's not the entirety of the relationship. And that means, again, increasing trade and people-to-people contact and other types of diplomacy. On the security issues, I want to agree that the Manbij roadmap, which was a start of a process of understanding one another's must-haves in Syria and a conversation, really a collaborative effort to stabilizing northern Syria, is incredibly important. Not because it fixes all the issues, and I'll tell you that Manbij, just as one small piece of the problem, is incredibly complicated because of the way things develop there. There's a lot of other complicated pieces there and a lot of things in U.S. policy that we're not quite clear how they're going to play out just yet. But the fact that we're doing it in a collaborative method, and I can tell you this much, there are detailed conversations going on between our diplomats and our security professionals. That hasn't really happened, at least not to that degree, during the past 5 or 6 years of the Syria conflict. Once that plays out and the Syria stabilization process, however it's going to look, unfolds, I think this uniquely distorting factor is also going to recede somewhat. If you look away from Syria, there are so many places in which our security interests clearly do overlap. Iraq is one. Afghanistan's another. There are places in Africa and Central Asia. We can talk about energy security, as well as just the hard CT fights and geostrategic security and stability. So I don't want to make it sound as if all the damage of the past 8 or 10 years will be undone by the winding down of the Syria conflict, but it's an overused metaphor, I think, on my part, but I've always said with regards to Syria and Turkey, if you're going to put your finger in your friend's eye to get something out, you tell them how long you're going to keep it there, and then you tell them when you're going to pull it out. And I think, we are getting closer to the point where we're going to be pulling that finger out of the eye, so to speak. Current security concerns are numerous, but I think they're all things that we can deal with. And when I say security concerns, I mean security initiatives by one side or the other that are causing concern in the policy elites of the counterpart. S-400 missiles is one such, and probably this group is reasonably familiar with how that all developed. There were a number of reasons that the Turkish defense establishment, going back to 2012 and 2011, and even earlier, was interested in a long-range and mid-range air defense system. The Turkish interpretation is that the U.S. was not particularly forthcoming with regards to the best systems with technology sharing and co-production. So first, the Turks looked at a Chinese system. Ultimately, they decided not to go with that system, and then looking at a Russian system. So I understand the logic as it looks in Ankara. It's a very different logic as we look at the problem set from the United States side. There are serious discussions ongoing about this now, but I, for my part, still firmly hope that the decision ultimately is not taken to purchase the S-400s, because the introduction of a major Russian manufactured weapon system into a NATO ally's armament would cause all sorts of problems from a technical level, let alone the political level, which relates to congressional sanctions and the CATSA Act and things like that. And could actually interfere with Turkey's acquisition of the F-35, which is a joint strike fighter, has long been a sort of a bedrock of defense industrial cooperation between the two sides. I would say that both of those can be solved with goodwill. There is a sequence of events that I can imagine that would unfold. It has to do a little bit also with some things related to the state of emergency, specifically the detention of some American citizens and employees of our diplomatic representations in Turkey. That is tied to the defense industrial cooperation because of Congress's intense interest in that. There have been some very productive meetings on that recently, and I for one, am heartened by what I think could happen in the next month or so. In that, there's a chain of virtuous circumstances that could see a resolution on some of those that would take a Turkish initiative. And then perhaps some more creative thinking about how to get out of the S-400 dilemma and get back into the F-35 issue. Now, the F-35, technically, there are 2 planes that belong to Turkey now. They are staying in the United States. That was always the plan for additional testing and training of pilots. So if the S-400 is up and operating in Ankara, by the time that actual transfer of the planes out of the United States is supposed to happen, then we could be facing a crisis there. So I think it's the goal and the obligation of diplomats on both sides to get a resolution of that beforehand. I'd like to just say one last thing on the problems that I think, because of the very severe dislocations in the Turkish military over the last 10 years, and I don't mean just the factional uprising or coup attempt, but also the Balyoz and Ergenekon trials and all sorts of tensions related to that. I think there's been tension in the U.S.-Turkey military relationship. General Kimmitt and I think, can both remember a time when the number of exchanges between the two sides and interchange of training with Turkish officers coming here to train and Americans going for exercises or training in Turkey was much higher. That military-to-military contact really had great benefits. And I think we need to look at ways to renew that and to rebuild that, because in some ways, over the past decade, we've become strangers to one another at the level of military institutions. At the very top level, I understand that Minister Akar and his counterparts, when they were the Chief of Defense, Chairman Dunford, and the Ministers of Defense have had a very good, solid relationship, good communications. But below that level, I think there's sort of an estrangement that's occurred unintentionally on both sides over the past, I'd say, 10 to 15 years, and we need to look at ways to address that. When I look at the geography, as General Kimmitt mentioned, I see way more areas that we still overlap in than we are opposed to one another on. And that's why I'm still bullish on the overall security relationship moving forward. I also think that many of the things And you'll hear this thrown out as a facile observation in the United States sometimes. Well, yeah, but that's not the old Turkey. That's, Erdogan is X, or the Turkish military is Y, or they're Islamists, or that. I think a lot of that is not properly contextualized. I think a lot of those statements and judgments are based on a unique period of time over the last 8 to 10 years, while Turkey has had this factional struggle going on within the body of its political system. And when the Syria conflict was exerting such a distorting influence on bilateral relations. So I am cautiously optimistic that these things will get worked out, not immediately, but in the medium term. And meanwhile, the solid bones of the relationship, which are these congruent sort of civilizational values, I'll say that because I think we still have that, and the geopolitical interests are strong enough to make us both good partners for one another.
Thank you very much. Kadir.
Thank you. I want to point out a couple of things about the coup. At the time of the coup, how this was received by the Turkish public and how it reflected on the U.S.-Turkey partnership. I think the U.S.-Turkey relationship, I would agree broadly with my co-panelists, were strong, they are strong, and they will get stronger. But it's received some major hits along the way. And I would say that's not an exception, it's more of a actually regularity. And you can bring that back to Cold War years. I'm not going to talk about it, but even then, you had some major disagreements with Cyprus and all that. Why is that? When we question this relationship, yes, we are both NATO members and we have fought together, etc. You can outline all these positive agenda items, positive history, and going forward, I absolutely agree. Those exist there and they will be constituting kind of the bedrock of this relationship. I don't think this relationship will go away easily, but we have to just recognize certain realities such as actually geography. It works, it's to the benefit of Turkey, it's very important, Turkey's geography, and it makes it in many ways indispensable. But at the same time, Turkey is uniquely challenged in its neighborhood by a variety of security issues and concerns. And we don't always see eye to eye, like Rich was saying. I think that's not an exception, that's more the pattern. So we have to, as people who think about the US-Turkey relationship, we have to think about that dynamic. We will definitely have crises, and what's going to be the next crisis? We have to try to somehow foresee that and potentially work to avert it and contain it. There will be crises no matter what. Sometimes it's because of domestic politics of either countries. Sometimes it's because of regional challenges, but they will be there. And I think what happened on July 15th is variety of these actually came all together. Remember, on July 15, 2016, at that time, we had the Gülenist organization struggling against the government, fighting against the government from within for a while now, since late 2013, December 2013. So you already had several years of the state security establishment in many ways actually fighting itself, because these people were well positioned, strategically positioned there, receiving their orders from outside, hiding themselves really well, etc. And I agree, like Rich said, it's very hard to understand from outside. It was not that difficult to understand from inside, but it was still very, very surprising that they could go to this extent to achieve their political goals. It was understood to be a sort of civil society organization broadly that did have representation in the government, which was opposed by the old sort of Kemalist establishment, but the conservative said that this should be legitimate. Conservative people should be able to participate in the government. But we found out that wasn't the case, that they actually had strategic plans to usurp power basically at the expense of the legitimately elected government. So that fight was ongoing internally, and a lot of details were not necessarily coming out, but it was in the media. People knew. So in many ways, the July 15 attempt was their last sort of attempt to both survive and end that fight in their favor. Domestically, that was happening. Along the Syrian border, like Rich was talking about, PKK, in the earlier panel in this morning, it was mentioned, Şener Aktürk mentioned that PKK had already declared war on Turkey for about a year now, full-scale war, that it was going to take over regions and cities, especially in the southeast. So domestic terrorism at a sort of unforeseen level. And then you have Daesh along the border with Syria, and you have constantly rockets and security threats coming from Syria. So you have domestic terrorism, you have regional sort of security concerns from Syria, and at the same time, the security establishment has to deal with this unique sort of problem for essentially fighting its own self in many ways. So when the attempt happened, and I must say, all these three are in one way or another related to the US or US policies in the region, in the eyes of the Turkish public and Turkish policymakers. You know, the US was had started in 2014 September to help the PYD forces in Syria, and it was attacking obviously Daesh, and it found them as local reliable partners. So the US was there, relevant in these debates in Turkey, both on the PKK front and Daesh. And then with the Gülen movement, at the time it was called Gülen movement, the FETÖ terror organization, their leader was in the US, and they were they had acquired a lot of lobbying power and influence on the Hill, as you know. For a while, they used it in the name of Turkey, actually, and but that was also deteriorating. And what I'm trying to say is that all these PKK, Gülen, Daesh issues, these at home, when we were discussing and debating it, in one way or another, the subject would come to America. And I think when the US reaction under Obama was perceived as weak, not immediate in the time of the coup, the colleagues, American colleagues here say, you know, it was a Friday, we couldn't figure out right away, etc. Regardless of what happened exactly, the perception in Turkey was that US waited to see what would happen. And that all contributed to the deterioration of the US-Turkey relationship. I think that really created a big damage on the partnership. But within a month, you saw Turkey launching the Euphrates Shield operation in northern Syria, both to confront Daesh and the PKK, and probably to restore the self-confidence of the Turkish military, right? And there it came a bit of as a surprise, right? People didn't expect it to happen so soon and so forcefully. And there were a lot of doubts whether it would succeed, but it did eventually succeed. And it was actually followed up by further military action in northern Syria. Basically, Turkey's security establishment telling the US and Western partners they were serious about the PKK threat in northern Syria. So that ended up with the most recent Manbij agreement between the two sides. And I agree, it's a very positive development and it can be built upon. But more importantly, I think the US side is now saying, look, we really need to listen to Turkey, okay? We don't have to do everything they say. They're not going to do everything we say, but we do have to listen to each other. So within almost 2 years, we came from a highly suspect, deeply suspicious sort of Turkish public opinion and political policymakers' perspectives to a place where I think both sides are at least talking and listening to each other and trying to build a better sort of cooperation. Of course, you can't just jump to the moon from here. We are still talking about very limited sort of overlapping interests on the ground being figured out, but it is something that can be built upon. And I also want to mention the S-400s. Of course, the relationship with Russia has its own dynamics and etc. I'm not going to go into that. But the sort of lack of support is lack of influence on the Hill is not helping Turkey in that regard. As I said, Turkey will have to rebuild that. In the past, it kind of relied on other lobbying groups on the Hill, but in the new era, it's going to have to think about that because the role of Congress can always be a spoiler in the security to arrangements between the two sides. Finally, I want to say we talked about this in the morning, but what the process that has arguably taken decades from what we call tutelary system, where basically the military or institutions aligned with the military would oversee the political system. Most important decisions, strategic decisions, etc., would have to be somehow run by them, and you need their approval. I think with the most recent elections, June 24th, and the establishment of the new cabinet, the new presidential system, we have turned a major turning point. Now the General Chief of Staff is under the Ministry of Defense, who is now, the former General Chief of Staff. But I believe that's supposed to help that kind of transition, and for the defense minister to have legitimacy in the eyes of the strength in the eyes of the military corps underneath. But nevertheless, this can sound like just a formalistic change, but I don't think it is. It's the completion of an era where that started with July 15. Turkish people said, no, we don't want military rule anymore. That won't happen again. And I think the political system change, the presidential system change in Turkey have formalized that decision made by the Turkish public. So I think going forward, of course, the Turkish presidential system will need to mature. It will take time for it to work fully. But I think the relationship between the US and Turkey for a long time, like you said, was military to military. Often it had actually difficulty legitimizing itself back in Turkey sometimes. They were making deals, but it wasn't really embraced by the civilian authority or the Turkish public in general. And if that dynamic can change going forward, I think that will have a significant impact on the health of the relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have a few questions for the panelists, and then I will open the floor for question and answer. General Kimmitt, can you remember if you need to make an analogy of the U.S.-Turkey partnership and alliance, and if you consider that in the last couple of years, the alliance, at least because of the several problems in Syria and other issues, went awry. Can you tell us what kind of what fixed the previous instances of alliances or the road accidents in the alliances? Can you remember any of U.S. alliance with another country that went this over?
No, well, certainly I can. I mean, I think back when France pulled itself out of the NATO alliance, that was far more of a shock than we're seeing here. We've had disagreements throughout, but what I think a more relevant question than that is this the worst rupture we've had in the relationship between Turkey and the United States? And I'd say no, by no stretch of the imagination. I think the situation in 2003 was far worse than today. The situation in 2003, we were pulling American units into Iraq. We were in the middle of a combat operation. We needed those additional troops. Those additional troops were prevented from coming through a allies country for the purposes of putting enough force into Iraq to fight against what we thought was going to be a much more difficult enemy. So no, I take a look at this situation that we're seeing now and perhaps put it second, but certainly not first in terms of the relationship between the United States and Turkey. So that's, again, another reason why I'm so optimistic. If we can get over one that actually affected the lives and the missions of American soldiers to the negative, we can get over this.
And Rich, I like that sequence. And can you elaborate about that a little bit and give us a scenario about the sequence of events that will bring another honeymoon in U.S.-Turkey relationship?
Well, no, I didn't say anything about a honeymoon. And I would offer for General Kimmitt's consideration, perhaps, that this is the third worst, because we do have the Cyprus as well.
Sure.
So, I mean, the ideal sequence from an American perspective.
But is it from the perspective of U.S., or do you think that it is, objectively speaking, in the alliance, this is the third worst?
That's a good question. I think I'm looking at institutional breach and legal actions and strategic actions taken against one another. I think subjectively, it may feel different to both sides at different times. So, for instance, on the night of the coup, to the extent that Turks did not feel that the Americans were being responsive or even cognizant of what was going on, that may have actually felt worse. That may have felt like a bigger breach. But what I'm talking about is actual institutional steps taken against one another, and that's why Cyprus in the post 1974 to 1979 or so 1980 stands out as clearly the worst. Once you get Congress involved, that is the arm that's much closer to the sort of the public sentiment of the United States, and if Congress is involved, we're in a bad place in terms of that relationship. Congress can get involved in very good ways as well, and that's what makes the S-400 so important right now. And I'll take this to the sequence that you're talking about, because S-400 absolutely has the attention of Congress. And if I think we're on a good trend. We're starting on a good trend. We did sort of a pivot around the Manbij discussions, and everybody's looking at this with more possibility than they were before the Manbij agreement. If there's something that could undo that and put us back into a Cyprus-type period, it would be the sequence under which Turkey gets the S-400. They're sanctioned under CATSA. The F-35 program does not move forward. And then all of a sudden it looks a lot like 1976 or 1977 again. So to avoid that, the ideal sequence from an American perspective is July 18th, I believe, is the next hearing for Pastor Brunson, against whom we feel charges are not justified by evidentiary weight. So the Turkish legal process works properly and effectively, and he is released shortly after that. Congress is happy about that. There's movement on the others as the state of emergency comes to an end in Turkey, and there's a general reassessment of the evidence against some of these Americans and American employees. And then a substantive good offer is made to the Turks with regards to our ability, because I think we have the ability to help Turkey meet its air defense needs, both for medium term or for medium range and long range, in the immediate term and in the long term. And I think there's been some very quiet but very substantive discussions over the last 3 months about how to give a deal that Turkey will find acceptable.
That will include co-production, or?
I'm not a technical guy. I'm not going to promise anything. We're not in a negotiation right now. But let's just say that it would be a deal that both sides would recognize as a good business deal. And then Turkey finds a creative way not to get the S-400. Or the two sides find another way to off-ramp that, and then the F-35s come, and Turkey has a state-of-the-art, cutting-edge military addition to its inventory, and we continue to be strong strategic partners regionally, not just in Iraq, Syria, places like that, but throughout the NATO area of interest and beyond. That's my ideal sequence.
Okay.
I will say this: it's possible. I'm not going to say probabilities. I won't get into prognostication, but that's how it can unfold.
Kadir, how about the sequence from the Turkish side? What would be an ideal sequence?
The ideal sequence. I mean, I think going back to basics, the national security threats, the relationship with the PKK, that comes first. That continues to be the overriding priority. I think the Manbij agreement really resolved some of the tension, and then the Turkish perspective on this, okay, the US is willing to work on this. That message, I think, will help. With regards to relationship with Russia broadly and S-400s, I think let's remember that Turkey's first address for that was the US. They couldn't the air defense systems are basically produced by private companies who have certain business structures. They won't share they won't do co-production deals, etc. That was the main reason that Turkey looked for other options.
The Russians won't give you co-production either.
Well, he whispered that Russians wouldn't give us co-production. I'm not saying they will. I'm just saying that was the reason Turkey looked at other options. Of course, what happened is that Syrian civil war exposed that Turkey didn't have its own national sort of air defense system. And then the national sort of arms industry in Turkey, the security industry, has also been weak. That's also another concern, to ramp up Turkey's own military production of pretty much everything, because a couple of times the Congress threats on holding up some of the arms transfers were problematic and damaging to the relationship as well. So it was just announced Turkey is in talks with over the Patriot sales, so that could be a remedy. But I don't know whether the US will insist either or, like you have to really get rid of S-400s, or even if you purchase them, you may not necessarily, use them or use it in a very limited capacity, etc. So that will have to be worked out. But the good news is that they are talking, and we are much better on that front as well than the earlier days of announcement of S-400s, where US said, we absolutely cannot tolerate this. That kind of, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that was kind of the reaction.
Message.
So, sorry, one last thing. I think the US foreign policy right now is going through an important, interesting phase where Trump administration is trying to figure out what its regional and global role is. And there is a big debate, and if I may call it a fight within the US security establishment. And that the answer to that question has not resolved, and it's going to, I think, impact the US-Turkey relationship as well.
General Kimmitt.
That's
Okay.
passive.
Okay. And I will open the floor for questions, and please identify yourself. Let's start with Şener.
Okay, I'll use the microphone. So I'll actually pick up where Kadir left off, because the big question, I'm Şener Aktürk, Koç University. I was the first panelist in the morning panel. The big question from the Turkish point of view is what the United States wants to do with Russia, right? Because Turkish American, Turkish British, Turkish Western relations for centuries have been derivative of Western-Russian relations. And I was surprised that when you identified potential areas of cooperation between Turkey and the United States, you mentioned Afghanistan and several other hotspots, but not Ukraine, Georgia, or Syria. Whereas these are three neighbors of Turkey, all three of which have been occupied by Russian military, and Russian Navy is now again hegemonic in the Black Sea. That's an immediate potential threat for Turkey. Bombing Tbilisi is a potential land forces threat for Turkey, and of course Russian Air Force and military in Syria is a potential threat for Turkey. But if so what is the US policy on Russia? Is it balancing against Russian expansion in Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Georgia, and Syria? Or is it in a way appeasing and, as Donald Trump, President Trump mentioned, recognizing annexation of Crimea, which would be a first since the Second World War, right? The change of territorial borders. Because those two options give very different signals to Turkey. If United States says we are getting out of Syria, we are settled with Russia, we will recognize the annexation of Crimea, East Ukraine, and Russia can do whatever it wants in Tbilisi and Georgia and Caucasus, that gives a bandwagoning signal to Turkey. If the US says, no, we will now seriously, militarily, and otherwise deter Russian expansion in all of these three fields, it gives a very different signal. Which one do you think is the US grand strategy now?
You're in
General
the State
Kimmitt?
Department.
Who's
I'll
going
defer to
first?
my colleague from the State Department.
Okay.
I should repeat that my answer
is
will
not
not be
State
the official
Department's
position of the
official.
State Department. So thank you, Shanair, for the question. It's an excellent question. And I'm going to give you a bit of a wonky answer. So in a democracy, unfortunately, policy is not systematic, rational, or predictable. There are actually competing theories about how policies work. One is called the rational policy model, which says it's cyclical. And we identify problems, we frame problems, we generate alternatives, we pick a solution, we implement the solution, we assess, and we restart the cycle. Starting in about the 1970s, there was broad academic recognition of the fact that that's not actually how things work here, especially in Washington, D.C., and especially on foreign policy. There's a theory called the garbage can theory. I think Kadir Ustun is the one who came up with the term that basically says foreign policy is like a garbage can. Every day Washington wakes up, throws in egos, problems, solutions, technologies, bureaucratic infighting, random chance, solutions looking for problems, shakes it up, and we reach in and we see what's there. Trying to actually come up with a rational and coherent policy. And it's not that we don't do that. We write down a lot of policies and a lot of strategies, and they become formal policy documents, and then they get put on a shelf. And then we deal with the real world as it emerges and evolves each day. Only, and this is my personal assessment, each presidential administration can really pick about three things and do them well, because it takes a lot in our system. You have to coordinate with Congress. You have to get the National Security Council on a steady diet of meetings to focus on a problem that brings in multiple departments. You have to get military assets, diplomatic assets, and money all moving at the same time, at the same place for a clearly established goal. And to do that 3 times in a presidential administration is remarkable. The first Bush administration managed the reunification of Germany, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the first Gulf War. And that took up all the bandwidth they had. And below that level, every other single international problem was essentially solved by people working at the country team level or at the second and third level of diplomacy and the military, sort of improvising as they went, or going until somebody told them to stop. Syria, which is one of the problem sets that you've noticed or raised and highlighted there, is one such example where we have had many different cross purposes and many different competing policy impulses since 2012 that have not clearly been identified. So we take it to your real question, which is about Russia. What is the U.S. policy on Russia? That presumes an ability for us to actually frame our relationship with Russia coherently and consistently over time. And I would assess that at least since 1991, we just have not done that. So you have to disaggregate and say, what is our policy towards Russia on a specific topic at a specific time? I will tell you that I'm not just old enough to have been in the Cold War military a little bit. I was trained, with the idea that the Russians, the Soviet Union, were the primary geopolitical threat. That's changed a little bit over time. I think the current administration, has a nuanced view on that. So China also plays a big role in how they prioritize threats. But I think the assessment is that we have to cooperate with Russia on some things, but we'd be fools to trust them. And they're not an ally. So can they be a partner on certain things? Again, I've worked for 2 years in Afghanistan. We have to have an understanding with the Russians of a sort when it comes to Afghanistan. Otherwise, we'll end up at cross purposes with one another. I would say Syria is another such place. This does not represent an opportunity for bandwagoning with us and Turkey and everybody else being in a congenial, nice relationship with the Russians, though, because at the same time that these things are going on, the Russians are poisoning people in London. They're enabling quasi-genocidal bombing of civilian populations in Syria. They're an illegal occupation of the Crimea, all of the things that you've already noted there. So I don't think, if you're worried about an axis shift where all of a sudden we fundamentally identify with them, I don't think that's in the cards. And frankly, it should be the US and Turkey talking about where we can both cooperate with the Russians rather than either one of us having conversations with the Russians as a primary friend or partner that we then somehow deconflict with the other. So I think that's my view on it.
General Kimmitt.
Yeah, I also, first of all, I agree with everything Rich said, but I also think we have a tendency to, for political reasons inside this country, amplify the challenges from Russia. Every president since ever has always said they're going to reset the relationship with Russia. I mean, you can see every president has tried to do that since the USSR fell. We talk about the interference with the American election. Sure, it was a little more sophisticated this time, but when hasn't Russia tried to interfere with our elections? Let's take a look at Russia. Why do we concern ourselves with Russia? For a couple of reasons. One, because there's the second largest, could be the first largest nuclear force in the world, so we have to accept that. Let's also take a look at Russia. Russia demographically is falling apart. Russia economically doesn't have the gross domestic product of Italy. President Putin, sharp poker player, but he is playing, he is bluffing, he is not playing with a strong hand. I think what this administration is trying to grapple with is the fact that, in their view, Russia took advantage of the situation in the last administration and their unwillingness to act, and quite frankly, they bluffed their way into a couple of good hands. Crimea, Ukraine, starting to put forces up along the Baltics. But in the long run, I guarantee some of the younger people in this room are going to look back 25 years from now and say, why were we so concerned about Russia? I mean, for goodness sakes, does anybody believe that that's the bear that they used to be? To me, Russia is that house down at the end of the street where all the bums live. It's just kind of a nuisance to the neighborhood. It causes problems. It slices your tires every once in a while. But in the long run, it's going to go away. We can take advantage, hopefully. We can use it in some very strategic ways. I believe that they could be with the United States, the reverse Nixonian link up with China. We've got to be very careful about what's happening to China. I think I'd rather have Russia and its landmass on our side as we are trying to offset the growing power of China. But if you take a look at where Russia and China were 25 years ago, the path of growth for Russia during that time period has been entirely negative. For China, it's been entirely positive. I think we're being bluffed by a former KGB agent. And quite frankly, in a lot of ways, he's the only guy keeping that house together. Start thinking about the post-Putin Russia. Start thinking about what it's going to do. Start thinking about what it's capable of doing. Because what we're seeing out of Russia is entirely idiosyncratic to one man. And there's not a Putin behind Putin. I see some people not wiggling their heads over there, and I'd like to hear your comment.
Let's get the...
Thank you. I heard some great scenarios, especially from Richard. Can I pose a different scenario? And like to hear everybody's response to it. Let's assume the Turks have said, not an assumption, we want the Kurds back, not just from Mandaj, all the way across the Euphrates to Iraq. The Americans have said, at least the colonel who gave the comment on it says, we're not going to let the Turks do that. It's That's number one. So you've got that thing frozen. Secondly, all the negotiations about the Patriots or whatever don't go through. And the S-400 does get set up, okay? Now, my question is this, I think will lead, as you said, to a real crisis in U.S.-Turkish relations. And from Putin's point of view, since Putin was mentioned, I think he would love to try to get Turkey out of NATO if he possibly could. Now, my question is, these two crises in U.S.-Turkish relations over northern Syria and over the S-400s, are they enough, given the fact the Russians also provide a lot of natural gas to Turkey, are building the nuclear reactor for Turkey, enough finally, given Erdogan's rather idiosyncratic way of running things, to pull Turkey out of NATO?
Rich and then Kadir.
I'll take a first stab at that. So both of the things that you laid out as elements of the scenario are feasible. Both could happen. On the issue of what they would lead to, I would say that even in the worst scenario, there is no gain for Turkey in pulling out of NATO. If Turkey came to the conclusion, even if the United States Congress directs, or if the State Department judges that in the spirit of the laws enacted by Congress, that sanctions have to be in place. So there's sanctions, and you can imagine, if you want to make the scenario even more dire, that the Hawk Bank procedures that involve the sanctions busting result in a large fine on the relative order, looking at what had happened with BNP Paribas and something equivalent to that, dollar for dollar. So big fine, big sanctions, continuing imbroglio in Syria. Even under that scenario, I don't know why Turkey would pull out of NATO. And I don't think there's a mechanism for kicking them out. NATO simply has too much value for Turkey as a defensive measure to not be outside of it, and therefore not have any of its weight institutionally applied against you. So if I were a decision maker in Turkey, I certainly would say that even under the worst set of circumstances in bilateral relations with the United States, we're not getting out of NATO. And again, I don't think that there is a mechanism within NATO to kick somebody out of it. That would have to be some sort of a new thing. And I think that would be, even from the American perspective, that would be a bad bargain. Because if you think that all of these things are conjunctural, that at some point each of those three elements or nodes of the crisis will pass, then no matter how bad things are with Turkey, you still don't want to kick them out if you're handling it through sanctions and other things. And the other thing I'll add in there is that any sort of a judgment by any Turkish leader that, well, really Russia is our better friend. And I understand in the current environment how some people have said that and some people probably believe it. I just don't think when you look at the realities of Turkey's economic situation, for instance, that the access to financial markets and the need for international financing, which are so dire and so important to Turkey right now, Russia can't do that. As the general was saying, there are so many limitations on what Russia can actually do to help, both in a civilizational and an economic and a diplomatic sense. That's a bad bargain for Turkey. So things can get really bad. That'll hurt us, and it'll hurt Turkey even more. I don't think it will result in them leaving NATO.
Kadir?
Well, I think when actually Rich was describing the U.S., how it can or it should approach to Russia, work on some things and then not others. It doesn't, they're not our friends. We can't trust them, that kind of thing. I would say the U.S., Turkish foreign policy towards Russia is similar to that. I don't think Turks are thinking, okay, now that we got these S-400s, we're going to be on a pact with Russia for common defense or something like that. It doesn't mean it's going to translate to a strategic sort of wholesale partnership in the long run, because there are doubts, a lot of Russia skeptics also in Turkey. But the perspective on the S-400s is not that, we're done with America now, we should turn to Russia for our security. No, it's actually the argument is from a national defense perspective. We need our own national arms industry and our national defense. We can't rely on patriots that could be easily pulled out in the Southeast, which happened with, So those kind of hesitations and the realization that we don't want to outsource our security anymore. We are a country living in a neighborhood that's very dangerous, and we need to develop all these capacities on our own, not necessarily at the expense of working with outsiders. So I think that approach doesn't mean that, oh, now NATO is obsolete, it's useless, let's get out of NATO and form a partnership with Russia. I don't think that's, when you look at Turkey's other partnerships, you see that compartmentalization, which is essentially a requirement now. You work on economy, you disagree on Syria, you are reliant on energy, but in return, you do other things. So I would say black and white sort of encampment of two sides, that kind of perspective is not going to explain. And the same thing, even if things go really, really south with the United States, I think as long as you have serious overlapping national security interests, you're going to find a way to work together. So I think that would be the driving force against what you're saying.
General Kimmitt?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that's been said here. Frankly, I don't understand what all the fuss is about the S-400s. I mean, in my mind, Turkey loses out in this deal quite simply because they lose all access to the integrated air defense system for NATO. They would lose more than they would gain. But nonetheless, that's a sovereign decision. And to suggest that somehow we're miffed because you're going to buy Turkish or produce Turkish instead of buy American would suggest that somehow Raytheon is running the foreign policy of the United States. I mean, for goodness sakes, we as somebody who's in the business of doing it, we fight tooth and nail, particularly in the Middle East, to sell American weapons to the allies down there. UAE probably buys 1/3 of their equipment from the United States. They buy the other 2/3 from abroad because they recognize that that's a form of diplomacy to be working their arms transactions to satisfy all of their allies. We're also watching the UAE, we're watching other countries develop their own national capabilities for their own. I mean, the UAE never comes to mind. What Jordan does with some of their equipment at the CAD-B. I mean, I don't understand what the fuss is all about. One thing I am certain, though, when significant diplomatic decisions are made emotionally rather than rationally, that never works out. And that's my major concern about what's happening here between the United States and Turkey, that we're going to make dumb decisions because of emotions, not because of rational decisions. And let me tell you, watch Putin. He never makes a decision emotionally. He is the best poker player I've ever seen, which is why he's doing so well. And that goes for both the American side and the Turkish side. I'm not pointing a finger at either side.
We'll get one last question, Alan.
Thank you. See Alan back there.
Yeah.
Alan Makovsky, Center for American Progress. One of the dramatic effects of the coup, I think, has been to advance significantly the process of civilian control of the military. I mean, immediately after the coup, the decision was made to take the theretofore autonomous military educational system and put it under the civilian structure, under Ministry of Education and under the Higher Education Council. And of course, in the recent decrees, this has gone further with the restructuring of the Supreme Military Council. I'm not sure I totally understand this. It's a very long document, but at least the way promotions will be made in the future can be made with the president simply making them, rather than it going through the annual Supreme Military Council process. So anyway, I'm sorry for the long-winded introduction, but I'm wondering if you could reflect on how you think these changes will affect the Turkish military of the future, and in turn, speculating on speculation how that might affect U.S.-Turkish military or security relations. And I guess the question in a way is really for all three of you, whoever wants to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me collect another one. The lady over there. Yeah. Yeah,
So obviously, foreign direct investment in Turkey is down. So I know a lot of issues with like the lira dropping in value. So how can Turkey and the U.S. engage in economic terms, and how can Turkey revive its economy, especially with the new executive system?
Kadir.
Well, I think the new reorganization, as you said, puts the, of course, we have to refer back to the old system to understand the significance of this. Again, I'm not such an expert, but in many ways, the military, high military council was way above the defense minister. So it had actually most important decisions, national security decisions, including, against PKK, announcement of new regional threats, including threats from countries, that was done at the National Supreme Council. And until a couple of years ago, until 2010, 11, I'm not entirely sure, but until very recently, that was mostly from military members. It was essentially army sitting there, couple members from the elected government, including prime minister, would essentially, I don't want to exaggerate it, but essentially rubber stamp it, what the military recommended. So that has changed, and that happened over gradually, and now you have that council essentially being relegated to a defense minister is going to be right up there, and the military is going to be underneath. And the military council will still meet, but I think the weight of its decisions will not be the same as before. That's at least on the paper, that's how it's supposed to be. I think that
will still make most of the promotional
promotions, I'm not sure, but as you said, I think the president, one of the critical things is president will be able to order directly to the generals, give orders to the generals. In the past, that wasn't the case. He could only order the general chief of staff, and it would run down from there. That's a lesson from the coup, because in the coup, if Hulusi Akar decided to go with the coup plotters, it was going to be end of the game, in the sense that army was going to be wholesale on that side, and probably a lot of blood was going to be shed. So some military leaders, you want them not to side with it, so you can. The president will be able to give orders directly to them. And going forward, if that system gets sort of established, I just hope that it's going to help the health of the U.S.-Turkey relationship, because it was, as I mentioned earlier, it was often seen in Turkey as basically military running its own show when it came to important matters, including the relationship with the U.S. And you remember in the late 90s when the relationship with Israel was also cooked by certain military members without the approval of the government or the general public. So,
Rich, you want to?
So I agree with everything that Kadir said, and Alan, I think the ultimate result of what's these reforms that are going on since the coup, including the most recent ones, is actually to bring Turkey's military closer to the Western model. The Turkish military was very autonomous, as Kadir has said, both in terms of how it ran its institutions without real oversight, but even influencing international and foreign policy. So I think that will change. The problem right now, in terms of mill-to-mill relations, is that we don't have a lot of plug-in points to that. There's a new National Defense University in theory, that oversees what had previously been very autonomous war colleges for each of the services in Turkey. I don't think we've got a partnership agreement with it yet. That will be something we need to do. It'll take a while to figure out if there's going to be any changes in ministerial prerogatives for the MOD, because now the Minister of Defense and the President have roles somewhat analogous in the Turkish system to what they had in the American system. Does that change the nature of how we plug in? We've got staff talks, we've got different things that happen at the mill-to-mill and the ministry-to-ministry level. Some of those will take time to regrow the connective tissue. I think the long-term effect of it will be positive. And I am frequently disagreeing with colleagues of mine who say things that are sort of along the lines of, well, you know, Erdogan has ruined the Turkish military. He's hollowed out the Turkish military. I think the numbers I heard today is that there's been a total of 5,000 or 5,800 military folks imprisoned and 15,000 removed from their jobs as a result of the coup investigations. Now, you know, that's you know, obviously would have to be evaluated whether that's good or bad based on the evidence used against them. But in a military the size of Turkey's, which I think still is the second biggest in NATO, it's not actually that big a chunk of the Turkish military. And from an institutional point of view, these changes can actually be propitious.
Last remarks.
Two things. The issue of FDI, I think that there is a great concern right now about, given the instability that is perceived by the international capital markets with what's happening inside of Turkey. I think that's one of the things that's one of the issues that's slowing down the money coming into the form of foreign direct investment. Personally, I'm doing my best to get as many dollars into Turkey. I spend a lot of time there. I spend a lot of money there, and I have a great time there. But I think once there's a better sensing of how the economy inside of Turkey is going to pan out over the next couple of years, you may see a restabilization of the lira, at least to my detriment. The one issue that I don't think we addressed were these comments made by both CJTF and the Turkish military about potentially the Turkish military going across the Euphrates back to the boundary of Iraq, so on and so on. Look, I mean, they were saying the same thing about Manbij. We worked our way through this. Can you imagine? I mean, there was a great movie years and years ago, Blazing Saddles, where the guy held the gun to his head and say, "Stand back or I'll shoot." And everybody's saying, "Watch out, he's serious." I mean, let's take that situation. We now have two NATO allies attacking each other. Well, an attack on one is an attack on all. So where do the other 24 countries line up? Whose side are they on? Who are they going to fight alongside? If it boggles the mind that anybody would allow a shooting situation come out between two NATO allies. It just, I think it makes for great headlines. I think the spokesman down in Baghdad, who first of all said we're going to stay in Manbij, and if anybody comes after us, we're shooting, who also said we're going to set up a border guard, basically preventing the Turks from coming into Syria. I just think that's all nonsense. And look, I know I've sounded quite flippant on some of these issues. Like all good generals, the reasons we can sound so flippant is because we had great subordinates like Rich that was actually doing the hard work and the hard analytical work so we could come up here and make flippant statements.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you for everyone. Thank you for our panelists. Thank you for everyone. It was a long day today, and I hope we will see you again in our next panels. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Good to see you.
And I'll be in touch.